Baldur's Gate 3 is fantastic and a triumph for the CRPG genre. For all of its small blemishes, this game delivers some of the most dynamic role-playing and fleshed out scenarios I've come across in a game. It can be a bit of a struggle getting into it at first, especially for those not familiar with Dungeons & Dragons, but once I was able to unravel its initial complexity, this has been one of the most engrossing role-playing experiences in years. I've been a huge fan of the RPG genre for easily over a decade at this point, and Baldur's Gate 3 checks a lot of boxes. An expansive, dense world, tactical turn-based combat, strong character development. But having no prior Dungeons & Dragons experience, this game was punishing at the start. Enemies were shoving me off cliffs, traps were one-shotting me, and this big-ass red goblin dunked on my party over and over. The level of punishment was daunting. I appreciated the level of freedom and room for discovery given to the player from the very beginning, but all of the skills, dice rolls, perception checks, and niche interactions were overwhelming. It took me a while to really grasp at what kind of strategies and tactics were even viable, but it was only when I figured out that I could pull off all sorts of cheese right back at the enemies that the game began to shine. The beauty of Baldur's Gate 3 is that this is a game where even the smallest decisions can have massive consequences. This makes for a fundamentally punishing game. Fail a dialogue dice roll, a boss ends you. Step on a trap, the trap ends you. Forgot to long rest before a big fight, having no spells is going to end you. On the flip side though, you can pass that persuasion check and the boss commits suicide. You make sure to take points in perception to see that trap, disarm it and get some great loot. You prepare your spells before a fight, carefully plan your loadout, and the encounter is a breeze. It's punishing, but the game is equally rewarding when you make smart decisions. For me, it's this very dichotomy that drives the game's wonderful sense of immersion. For the lack of a better word, this spiky choice design, where so many choices have drastically different and influential outcomes, encouraged me to closely examine the environment, look for clues within items, listen carefully to what every NPC has to say, and sneak in the shadows to gain positional advantages in fights. Not doing so got me stuck in tough encounters, but doing so brought me lavish success and rewards. Baldur's Gate 3 naturally pushes players to actively engage in the roleplay if they wish to win, an ironically lacking element in recent RPG offerings. Once I start to see the game from that angle, Baldur's Gate 3 became absolutely jaw-dropping. Without question, the sheer scope of what you can do in Baldur's Gate 3 is simply staggering. In so many other RPGs, your approach to the game's challenges is primarily centered around the combat system, be it turn-based or real-time. The gameplay, where the player's inputs can lead to victory or game over, takes place within the confines of the combat mechanics, with progression and character building systems playing supplementary roles that help shape your strategy and execution. There's usually a clear divide between the exploration section and the story section, and the combat section. This idea paradigm has been blown wide open with how gameplay in Baldur's Gate 3 works. The interactive environment and role-playing systems Larian Studios have developed from their original Sin games have come into full form here, serving as this flexible sandbox where environmental interaction, story, exploration, and combat interweave seamlessly within a consistent map. Nearly every object is interactable, and combat initiates without transition right there on the map environment. In or out of combat, you can push enemies off cliffs, one-shotting them. Your dialogue choices can turn NPCs into valuable allies or spontaneous, dangerous enemies. You can set traps with barrels, bombs, and all sorts of gadgetry to end combat encounters in a single turn. Throw a goblin at another goblin. Cast a rain spell making enemies wet, then cast lightning for double damage. If you even want, you can kill off your own companions before or after recruiting them. Your imagination is the only limit here, and I'm constantly floored by the wacky yet inventive interactions I come across in my playthroughs and what other people have discovered online. Combat itself is turn-based, and while it can seem unassumingly simple at first, is full of strategic nuances once class-specific abilities, items, and multi-purpose spells are all thrown into the mix. These fights are hard, especially compared to other modern titles. You're often outnumbered, caught off by surprise, missing attacks, and getting cheesed by bosses. So it's up to you to figure out ways to use sneak attacks, environmental cheese, and strong positional setups to get the edge. Once I realized how many different ways you can approach a single fight with all of your different attacks, dialogue, and utility skills, the brain juices started flowing. Each combat encounter then became a puzzle with near infinite ways of solving. This was a source of frustration at first, but became pure elation once I found that win. More often than not though, combat, for as fleshed out as it is, feels more like a key piece to an even larger gameplay puzzle, as it is really the only option to solve quests and conflicts. Non-combative approaches are also plentiful and equally rewarding, which I felt deepened the role-playing experience further, as I found many situations where the easiest approach, the moral approach, and other options in between were all pitted against one another. This encouraged me to pay careful attention to clues, NPC dialogue, and my own roleplay to decide which solution was fit for my adventure. There are many tough choices to make, but with how reactive Baldur's Gate 3 is able to acknowledge your decisions with distinct dialogue, rewards, and scenarios, no matter which decision you make feels rewarding with a sense of true ownership over your adventure. One caveat to all of this though, for those not versed in D&D, is that almost every action and combat and skill check in the game simulates a dice roll to determine whether the action succeeds or not. This can take some time getting used to, but overall, I felt that RNG lends an unpredictable quality to the adventure that I appreciated for keeping me on my toes. Sure, it sucks to miss an attack with 95% probability every now and then, but the replayability and unpredictability of the campaign kept me hooked nevertheless. The one complaint I do have here though is how Larian handles game overs. The player simply is forced to reload from a previous save, and I wish that they came up with a more sophisticated way of handling reloading that didn't forcibly take me out of the immersion and into save menus. There's nothing inherently bad about this approach, but for a game that does such a good job at keeping the player invested in the roleplay, dying and being forced to reload is a jarring reminder that you're still sitting in your own room. And unless you're a D&D or CRPG veteran, odds are that the average player is going to be dying a lot throughout their first playthrough. Some dialogue outcomes can be very punishing, putting you in a fight you're not ready for, or one misclick wasted in action can be the difference between victory and wiping out. The RNG too can be the sole deciding factor of winning and losing. The volatile nature of the game heavily encourages saving often, and I wouldn't be surprised if many players' experience with the game involved a lot of save scumming, which can break up the immersion the game does such a great job at setting. To improve this, I'd like to see their inspiration system expanded upon more, which currently allows you to reroll dialogue and skill checks should your first roll miss. Seeing this feature expanded upon to give limited rerolls to combat actions, or have an in-universe rewind feature to help players navigate their mistakes without going back to the load screen, I think could help direct players away from save scumming and rework their mistakes in-universe. Now that Baldur's Gate 3 has immersed me in my roleplay and decision making, the game slams down quality environment after environment, quality quest after quest that feels unparalleled in the genre. There were so many times where I'd find a secret room or cellar, either from stumbling into it by accident or to advance a quest, only to find a secret button in the secret room and enter a huge new extra secret region. I was wowed by small spaces, wide spaces, but it's the combination of detail, scope, and interconnectedness of all of these environments that really elevate exploration in Baldur's Gate 3 to the top. I'm reminded of the massive scale of Elden Ring, but also the intimacy and intricately connected passageways of Dark Souls. While perhaps Baldur's Gate 3 doesn't match either of those games in their respective strengths, the combination of these qualities plus plenty of its own creative flair makes Faerun one of the most memorable gaming worlds in recent memory. Even if there was nothing to do in these environments, they would still be interesting, as all of the items that decorate each room paint a story of what happened there. But Baldur's Gate 3 brings the quality content in spades. Quests in this game are rarely a simple A to B fare, but are instead filled with exploration, surprising twists, memorable storylines, and game-changing decisions that impact the larger story directly. Some quests even expand across the game's 3 entire acts, turning seemingly small expeditions into massive endeavors. Unfortunately, a few of these quests clearly have had their content cut short, likely due to development constraints, while some others are buggy. Events sometimes don't trigger correctly, if at all, and the quest log can occasionally refuse to update with the latest quest information when it is obvious that it should be doing so. These hiccups are infrequent enough, but do pull you out of the game's otherwise fantastic sense of immersion when they do come up, so it's worth mentioning. As for the story, I wasn't completely blown away by the main narrative, which felt kind of par for the course as far as fantasy saving the world stories go. Instead, I was far more impressed by the fantastic cast of characters, impressive, more intimate side stories, and some of the best dynamic storytelling I've seen in a game. The companions that join your party span a wide representation of D&D races, each having a unique backstory and genuinely gripping character development across their quest lines. This is thanks to fantastic voice work and dialogue by the actors and writers, who did an amazing job at selling you the believability of this world. In particular, I thought Lae'zel, Shadowheart, and Asterion's development were excellent. I enjoyed seeing how their values and worldviews gradually shift as a consequence of your decisions and the larger events throughout the game. By the end, these companions are different people from where they started, which makes the whole adventure feel all that more significant and organic. However, I did notice that some companions got more love during development than others, with some questlines being much more detailed and involved, while others rather simple. Karlach, for instance, as interesting as a character as she is, has a much less involved questline than Lae'zel or Shadowheart. I heard that her content got cut due to development constraints, which is a shame since they gave Karlach a very interesting backstory and plight. She has a mechanical heart that is at risk of overheating and failing, so her questline centers around fixing her heart, quite literally. Unfortunately, in practice, there isn't all too much to her quest besides delivering a few items. It is also evident by the end of the game that Act 1 is the most polished of all the acts, containing the most detailed dialogue and nuanced reactions. While Act 2 and Act 3 are full to the brim with quality content in their own right, some spots, especially in Act 3, lack the same level of dynamism in how the game reacts to your decisions as it did in Act 1. You can clearly see that the developers' visions were even larger than the massive scope of the game as it is already, but alas, some parts had to be cut. Despite my minor nitpicks though, I still can't stress enough how good and engaging this game is. When you have all of these gameplay systems, the combat, the exploration, the dialogue options, the character progression, all working in tandem at such a high quality, you end up with an experience where your choices feel both impactful and acknowledged. For an RPG, this is everything, as in order to immerse yourself in a role, the feedback of the world must match the action for the roleplay to feel genuine in its interactions. Combat and exploration are strategic. There are secrets hidden behind secrets. Baldur's Gate 3 is always ready to surprise the player with its scope, scenarios, and level design that makes the 100-hour plus campaign almost feel short in the best ways possible. There's something to be said for a game of this tremendous length that once you finish playing, makes you immediately want to start a second playthrough. I'm already well onto finishing my second run as a paladin and thinking about even a third. The hype and praise are right on this one. Baldur's Gate 3 is a phenomenal time that anyone interested in RPGs should take a look.